Hi, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you some of the concepts that we didn't get a chance to talk about further in class this morning. So this will hopefully be brief, but just a few big takeaways about, the workers and some of the issues that they were facing in the Gilded Age. And I think a lot of this does relate to our lives today. In the piece, What a Working Man Wants, Sam Gompers, who's head of the AFL, is really describing a great deal of, issues that workers don't have enough leisure time. And he's responding to some of the crisis and disruption that came from industrial work, and factory work is monotonous and, really making a product that nobody could really feel ownership over. And the working hours were long and the jobs were, repetitious. And maybe in our modern day, we might also think of our lack of leisure time. And so maybe there's a connection there for us in terms of in our economy, which is very information based, we're seeing some, new kind of challenges with maintaining, concentration and focus in a very, very heavy way, almost 24/7 because of technology and screen time. We also have a lack of leisure time, and perhaps, some of the issues, attached to like the Great Resignation or things like that are connected to some of this like alienation or lack of meaning or overload of time that people are dedicating to work. And maybe there's some parallels, and maybe also like the Gilded Age in today's time, we see skilled and unskilled work very much as like a bifurcated labor market. Skilled work is generally much higher pay, and skilled work is essentially educated individuals. In the case of unskilled work, we see real wages primarily falling. And so we have that issue, kind of a larger issue within our labor market that's really important. And perhaps it's even accelerating as a result of the pandemic. So the disruption, in our case is very present too. And, just like us in the time period of the Gilded Age, people didn't necessarily recognize, the degree of every little bit of social and economic change is something happening right before their eyes. But that was kind of what was happening. And I suspect someday we'll be writing about, our time period too as a challenging time of a great deal of, economic and social change. But in any case, some of the arguments in What a Working Man Wants, I think, are pretty straightforward. Clearly, Gompers is talking about a greater, degree of lines drawn around the 8-hour workday so that there becomes, leisure time for workers. And he makes a case that that's really good for the workers, but he also makes a case that it's good for all of society. And he is refuting certain arguments. There was an argument that, individuals who are working many, many hours a day, are just going to kick back and drink alcohol, and they're going to be, rebel rousing at the taverns, and this is going to cause problems for society. Largely, he's refuting that argument that, people with leisure time might make good use of their time. And he also does have some arguments that lean in toward nativism, and that becomes an important thing to keep in mind. There are some groups, including like unskilled immigrant labor, non-English speaking immigrants tended to be marginalized, Chinese immigrants, and we see that play out in this particular piece of What a Working Man Wants. So this is, maybe a continuation of like the Free Soil Party to some degree. This is not something that is really allowing for a great deal of inclusion when it comes to defining the working man. And so that's important to keep in mind. A few other big takeaways from this, and I would put, the bread and butter unionism in the AFL not in a socialist camp. They're very much looking to create some moves for the federal government or the state government to grant an 8-hour day and to have a law connected to that, and maybe also to ensure that wages are higher, but they actually try not to use strikes. Of course, they do ultimately use strikes, and because it's a craft union, there's a lot of different members. It's actually at the Homestead Strike that we see AFL. The Steel Amalgamated is really a branch of the AFL. So it's like the AFL is like a loose kind of membership of a whole bunch of smaller unions that really have their own agendas. And so in industry-specific agendas, geographic-specific agendas, and some of those agendas do get rather political and, to some degree, in some cases, even radical. In the case of the Homestead Strike, which you spent some time with, now we're in 1892, we could look at a couple of things. One is Carnegie's not even around when the strike happens. He's overseas, but he's put his entire steel mill in the hands of Henry Clay Frick, who speaks to kind of a new burgeoning white-collar class of individuals. There's a business-minded manager level that is overseeing a lot of the operations. Carnegie is like less significant to the day-to-day operations of the Homestead Mill than, say, somebody like Henry Clay Frick, who's really in charge. There had been a lot of activity at the Homestead Mill, but in this case, in 1892, the activity is because of lower wages. Carnegie lowers wages, and as a result, there's going to be a strike, and there's going to be a variety of efforts that Henry Clay Frick will take. The big one, of course, is calling in the Pinkertons, who essentially escalate the strike to something of a battle. So we get a great deal of violence in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a place where we see a large amount of steel production, railroad production, as well as mining. So it's a place where it's like a labor hotbed. Pennsylvania is a place where there's just a great deal of labor strikes. Homestead Strike is one of them. I won't go through all the elements of it because I think you have it, but the idea and the big takeaway is that in this like pitched battle between the Pinkertons, who are trying to replace, the workers who are striking, people are killed, and the National Guard of Pennsylvania is called in to stop the violence, and it pretty much squelches the Union. The Union activity is going to be demoralized after this and largely ineffective. Another element of this is there's a socialist strain in American society at the time. Emma Goldman, who was like a well-known socialist, and her lover decide that they are going to get involved in getting back at Henry Clay Frick, and there's actually an assassination attempt on his life. He's not assassinated, but Bergman, who is the person that was with Emma Goldman, end up, kind of paying the price in jail time for that attempted assassination, and it also taints the Union again as being like socialist and radical. So the unions are constantly battling this like public image. This gives a perspective from the worker point of view. The Homestead Mill is protected by the McKinley Tariff, and a Pinkerton, army wanted, pauper laborers. So, speaking to the way in which, the companies had the larger control, and they had the ability to hire these armies or to call on the state, or the federal government in some cases. The Pullman strike is the last one to kind of look at as a significant event, and it's significant because it really births some of the radical activity of Eugene Debs. The Pullman company, they made railroad cars, and so it's a pretty significant company, and they have a company town. So the company town means that if you work in the company town, you weren't paid in cash, you were actually paid in script, and then you could use your script to pay for housing, you could pay for, if you went to the local store, everything was like Pullman dollars, it's like being in Disney World, like everything is just kind of paid for through your script. What Pullman did was he lowered wages, but did not change any of the rent. So everybody's, script was worth, nobody was getting enough script, and it was a problem, right? So the wages being low end up creating a huge strike. And this is a street in the Pullman company town, one of the few company towns that are in the United States, but probably the most significant one. Here's a quote: "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell." So, kind of speaking about the lack of control in a Pullman town where you're essentially, your entire life is really dedicated to the company, okay? The company owns everything. But Eugene Debs, who is somebody who was a labor activist, he was involved in railroad labor disputes, and he was involved in creating a union, in a sense, of a variety of different people in the railroad workers, and he becomes much more radical after the Pullman strike. He was actually jailed because he was part of the strike. There's a sympathy strike because of the impact on the Pullman car workers, some people who are railroad workers decide we're not going to, we're going to strike wherever Pullman cars are used. So we see Pullman cars, we're not going to move them. We're just going to sit out and we're going to strike. And so this becomes a big issue because the government hooks up some of the mail cars to Pullman cars. So the stoppage and the strike is not only affecting the Pullman cars, it also affects the mail, and the federal government then creates an injunction. The strikers must stop. The strikers must stop because they're interfering with the Postal Service, and Eugene Debs, who was a labor leader, gets thrown in jail, and he becomes very much radicalized and a leading socialist. He'll run for president a series of times, including in 1912. He actually gains at 1.6% of the vote, so his efforts are pretty significant. And he speaks out in the time period of World War I against World War I. So he's influential in a variety of spaces, but in the early 1900s, he's speaking to an ideology of socialism that really rejects the whole notion of corporate capitalism and this industrialization that is led by the capitalist class. The accumulation of capital he sees as the primary problem, and he and others become very, very attached to a end to capitalism and an effort to nationalize a great deal of the the railroads, for example, other types of industries as well. So we refer to his form of unionism as industrial unionism, just to give you a sense. And of course, the Russian Revolution is brewing in the early 1900s, and that also creates some ties. There will be some American labor activists who become very tied to the Russian Revolution. Some American labor activists will travel to Russia and participate in the Russian Revolution. So ways in which this effort of socialism becomes seen as something that could be international in scope, and there's a component of that. In the Debs case, the Supreme Court basically says, Debs has to be jailed, and he does. Okay, he does get jailed. So just to kind of showcase some of the differences between these types of unions, like where the AFL, this craft union, skilled, fairly discriminatory, has a very nationalist focus and kind of cooperating with capitalism in something like Eugene Debs' model, and will attach this type of industrial unionism not only to like Lucy Parsons, the piece that you read, because she advocates for socialism and women in socialism. And here we get a sense of one of the differences with the socialists. They're very inclusive. We have a great deal of Black Americans in the Socialist Party. Du Bois is going to move into this, for example. We also get a great deal of women, and Lucy Parsons is somebody who's an interesting character because she becomes a labor activist. So does Emma Goldman, both like notable socialists, and they have leadership roles in the Socialist Party. So there's political parties that correlate with industrial unionism. Socialism is not exclusively going to be a way in which unions are going to kind of create their ideology. We'll also see some political parties surrounding socialism, some of which are still present to this day. But non-discriminatory, skilled and unskilled work together, much more international. So there becomes kind of this idea of like workers of the world unite, some connection maybe to Marxism, and the idea of there being a international party of workers where workers will essentially be able to own the factors of production. Some of that is of interest, and they're advocating socialism. We see socialism pop up in a big way in our local area, in Patterson. There's a massive silk strike in 1913. A lot of this is because of greater workloads. It's not as much because of like lower wages, but increases in workloads. And we get this massive silk strike. It's one of many strikes in Patterson, but the silk strike is definitely the biggest, and it's also fairly violent. The Patterson silk workers are pretty skilled workers, and they're seeking some opportunity to kind of maintain some of the kind of professional aspect of their jobs. They feel like they're being treated, like unskilled workers in a sense, and they are looking for, a greater say in their work, and also in greater, ability to not have, 4 looms at one time or whatnot. The workers, when they go on strike, they go on strike for some time, actually to their own risk because they're not paid at all. And so there's a whole bunch of charity efforts done, including, charity efforts for children to try to keep the strikers able to feed their families. The picture that you're looking at is in Halden. A lot of the strikers would meet in Halden because the mayor was socialist. There was actually a socialist mayor, and even though Paterson was part of the AFL, so they had that like craft union thing going on, they become a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more radical, and they call in the industrial workers of the world. Big Bill Haywood and a few others come in to create more of a socialist model within Paterson. It doesn't really go in that direction, and the workers are not successful. The AFL at the end of the day ends up being the more successful union because public opinion about them doesn't get as sour, and they accomplish small things like the 8-hour workday. In a lot of states, the 8-hour workday does become a reality, and we do see later on a great deal of efforts about things like workmen's compensation, oversight of factories so that they're not dangerous, and things like that. So some of what the AFL was calling for. The IWW, sometimes known as the Wobblies, gets a much more violent rap. They were willing to sabotage factories, set fires, things like that. And it creates a little bit of a public opinion problem, something that happens in Paterson. In an effort to raise funds for the strikers, the Paterson strikers actually perform a giant play of the strike. They reenact the entire strike on the stage at Madison Square Garden, and they perform it. And they perform it for money. And it's an interesting thing to kind of use art in a political way. We see this kind of happening. It is also not terribly successful. They don't raise a great deal of money, but it speaks to this changing nature of who has access to art, in what way they're using art, and how art becomes much more political in the time period that we're talking about. I hope that was interesting. I'll see you in class.